Big Daddy found dead. The shocking murder of Gary Farris and the dark secrets behind it. True crime documentary. The house was silent. The kind of silence that pressed against your skin. Outside, the wind howled. The trees swayed in the night, casting long, eerie shadows. But inside, the house felt still. Too still. Gary Farris, known to most as Big Daddy, was missing. He was a figure, a man who commanded attention. His hands, rough from years of hard work, always seemed to hold something. A tool, a drink, a cigarette. But tonight, there was nothing. His bedroom door was ajar. The lamp beside his bed flickered, casting strange shapes on the walls. It looked normal. Too normal. But something wasn't right. The smell of blood was faint but unmistakable. A metallic scent, sharp and heavy in the air. And then there was the body. Gary's lifeless form lay crumpled on the floor. His once strong hands were now limp. His eyes wide open. Frozen in shock. The room was too quiet now. No one had heard a thing. His wife, Sarah, stumbled in, her eyes wide, heart hammering in her chest. She screamed, but it didn't feel real. Nothing felt real. Big Daddy's murder was sudden, brutal. But it was more than that. It was personal. And someone close to him had done it. The question lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Who? Everyone had their secrets. The men who worked for him, the people who admired him, even Sarah. The phone rang. It was his right-hand man, Mark. A shaky voice. Gary's dead, isn't he? A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The silence spoke louder than words. The phone call ended abruptly. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit, but the picture was still unclear. Who could have done this? The investigation began immediately. The team poured in. Detectives and crime scene analysts. But nothing made sense. Gary's office was undisturbed, his personal effects untouched. Except for one thing. A torn photo. Of Gary and Mark. Fingers trembling, Sarah picked it up. She stared at it. The photo wasn't just old. It was recent. But the man beside Gary, it wasn't Mark. It was someone else. Someone she didn't recognize. And that's when the real fear settled in. The fear that no one was who they said they were. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her hands shook as she held the photo closer, inspecting the unfamiliar face. The man next to Gary had a smirk, like he knew something no one else did. Her heart pounded in her chest. Who was this man? She dropped the photo, the edges crinkling as it landed on the floor. The air in the room felt thick, like something was closing in on her. She stepped back, her feet unsteady on the hardwood. The walls seemed to close in. Mark. She needed to talk to Mark. Her phone buzzed, pulling her back into the present. A message from an unknown number. Asterisk, you know who did it. You know what happens next. Asterisk. Her fingers trembled as she typed. Who is this? No reply. She stared at the screen for a long moment. The silence in the room pressed harder. Was it a threat? Was someone watching her? There was no time to think. She needed answers. Her mind raced back to the night before. Gary had been different. Something had changed. The way he looked at her. The way he whispered, "Stay close, Sarah. Something's coming." But she hadn't understood. She hadn't thought much of it. Now it felt like a warning. Her feet moved before her mind caught up, carrying her downstairs. She reached the kitchen, but her eyes went straight to the basement door. It was ajar. A small sliver of darkness beyond it. A chill crept up her spine. Gary had always kept that door locked. Always. She didn't hesitate. She descended the stairs, the darkness swallowing her whole. The air was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the warm house above. Her footsteps echoed on the concrete floor, too loud in the silence. The basement was a maze of old crates, boxes, and tools. But there, in the corner, was a single chair. And in the chair, a figure. A man. Not Gary. Not Mark. But the same man from the photo. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Sarah's stomach twisted. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Who are you?" The man didn't move, but his lips parted slowly. I'm the one who knows the truth. A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. The world around her seemed to tilt, like it was all unraveling at once. He finally looked at her. His eyes were dark, empty, and full of something Sarah couldn't name. But it wasn't fear. Not from him. Gary didn't die by accident, the man said, his voice low. You've been lied to. The truth. It was there, hanging in the air. But she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear it. Not yet. The man stood, and the floorboards creaked under his weight. Her heart raced, but she didn't move. You'll find out soon enough, he said. And with that, he walked into the darkness. The basement door slammed shut behind him. Sarah was left in the stillness. The truth felt closer now, but it was as if it were being kept just out of reach. Everything she thought she knew was falling apart, and someone was waiting to pick up the pieces. The air in the basement felt suffocating. Every breath was sharp, cold. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Sarah stood frozen, the last words of the man still ringing in her head. You'll find out soon enough. Her body moved on instinct, her feet carrying her up the stairs, though every part of her screamed to turn back. She slammed the basement door shut behind her, heart pounding. The house felt different now. Strange. Empty. The silence was unbearable. Her mind raced. Who was he? What did he know? What was happening? She grabbed her phone, hands shaking, and tried calling Mark. No answer. The silence on the other end was a harsh reminder. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Not Mark. Not Gary. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she didn't know what to do. Her thoughts were swirling, a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She turned back to the living room. The photo, the strange man, the warning, the basement. Everything was connected. She had to go back. No matter how afraid she was. The truth was buried somewhere in that house, and she had to uncover it. She couldn't run from it. But before she could make a move, the front door creaked open. A shadow crossed the threshold.
Mark.
He stood in the doorway, his face pale, eyes wide. I know who did it, he said, his voice low, urgent. Sarah's stomach twisted. He was lying. She could see it in his eyes. No, you don't, she said, her voice trembling. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, but something about his presence made her skin crawl. Mark wasn't the man she thought she knew. Not anymore. I didn't mean for this to happen, he whispered, his gaze shifting to the ground. I didn't know what else to do. Sarah felt her breath catch. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely audible. Mark ran a hand through his hair, looking desperate, like he was fighting with himself. Gary, he was going to ruin everything. He was going to expose us. All of us. Sarah felt a chill spread through her chest. Expose us? What are you talking about? Mark's eyes flickered to the living room, to the hallway leading to the basement. He knew. He knew about the money, about the deals, about everything. Everything. Sarah repeated, feeling her legs weaken. He nodded slowly. I didn't mean to kill him. But when he found out, he started threatening me. He said he'd go to the cops. He'd take everything down. I couldn't let him. Mark's voice cracked, the weight of his words sinking in. I didn't have a choice. Sarah stared at him, her mind spinning. The pieces were falling into place, but they didn't fit together the way she expected. Why didn't you tell me? She asked, the question hanging in the air. Mark swallowed hard, stepping closer. I wanted to protect you. I didn't want you to get dragged into it. But now they'll come after both of us. His words hit her like a punch to the gut. The man in the basement, the lies, the photo. It all made sense now. The truth was darker than she ever imagined. Gary had been a part of something far bigger than she could have understood. And Mark? He was caught in the middle just like her. But who had actually killed Gary? And why did it feel like they were all tangled in a web that none of them could escape? Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from upstairs. The sound of footsteps. And then a voice. Sarah. It was cold. Commanding. Not Mark. Not anyone she knew. Someone else. A chill ran down her spine. The door to the basement swung open. The figure from earlier was back. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, but her body felt frozen. The world around her blurred as she stared at Mark's lifeless body, blood pooling around him, spreading across the kitchen floor. Victor stood over him, as if nothing had happened, his eyes never leaving hers. The knife was still in his hand. Her hands trembled, her mind racing, desperate for some escape, some way out. But she couldn't breathe. Her throat was tight. She couldn't make a sound. Victor's smile widened, slow and predatory. "You are always the weak link, Sarah," he said, his voice almost affectionate, like he was talking to a child. "But you've got something in you. I'll give you that." She took a step back, her feet stumbling over the kitchen tiles. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I don't know what's going on. I don't." Victor raised a hand, cutting her off. "Don't lie to me," he said, his tones suddenly sharp, dangerous. "You knew enough to ask the right questions. You're not as innocent as you pretend to be." Her mind spun in confusion. What was he talking about? Before she could process the words, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Victor's face darkened. "They're coming," he muttered, his eyes flashing with something fierce. "But they're too late." He stepped closer to her, his footsteps soft but sure, like he was savoring the moment. Sarah's instincts kicked in. She couldn't stay still. She couldn't let him finish whatever he planned. Her eyes darted around the kitchen, searching desperately for something, anything, she could use. The drawer beside the sink. She lunged for it, her fingers shaking as she yanked it open. The clatter of silverware and utensils filled the room, but her focus was razor-sharp. Her hand closed around the handle of a heavy chef's knife. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Victor was watching her, still calm, but there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Oh, Sarah," he sighed, as if she were an amusing child. "This won't end well for you." He took another step forward. She raised the knife, her arm shaking but determined. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, the words sounding foreign in her own mouth. Victor chuckled, low and mocking. "I don't think you understand, sweetheart. You should be—" Before she could react, he lunged at her. Time seemed to slow as Sarah brought the knife up, desperate to protect herself, her arm moving in instinct. But Victor was faster. He grabbed her wrist mid-swing, twisting it violently. Pain exploded in her forearm as the knife flew from her hand and skittered across the floor. He had her. Trapped. She tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. His eyes locked onto hers, cold and predatory. "You should have stayed out of this, Sarah. You should have stayed quiet." The sound of the sirens was deafening now. Closer. But it didn't matter. Not to him. Victor leaned in, his breath hot against her skin, his lips curling into that same unsettling smile. "I told you it's too late." And then, just as she thought he was going to strike, a loud crash echoed through the house. The front door slammed open. Several men burst into the room, guns drawn, shouting orders. Victor didn't flinch. But Sarah nearly collapsed with relief. The figures in the doorway were wearing badges. "Police." "Freeze," one of the officers shouted. "Put your hands where we can see them." Victor's eyes narrowed, the smile fading. For a moment, it seemed like he might fight back, but then with a sudden movement, he dropped the knife and raised his hands. The tension in the room shifted, the oppressive fear lifting, if only slightly. "Is he?" one of the officers asked, his voice trailing off as he spotted Mark's body on the floor. Victor didn't answer. Another officer moved toward Sarah, helping her step away from Victor, his hand steady on her shoulder. "We've got him," the officer said softly, but Sarah barely heard him. Her head was spinning, her body shaking from the shock of everything that had just happened. Victor had been the mastermind, the one who'd pulled the strings, the one who'd killed Gary, the one who'd been manipulating everyone. And now he was caught. But as the officers moved to cuff him, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Something deeper. There was a look in Victor's eyes as he was hauled away. Something calculating. Something that suggested this wasn't over. For her. For anyone. As the police officer led her toward the front door, Sarah glanced back at the kitchen. And there, in the corner of the room, she saw the torn photo once again. The man in it. The stranger. It clicked in her mind. Victor wasn't the only one with secrets. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. As the police led Victor out of the house, his eyes never left Sarah. She felt his gaze, heavy and lingering, like a shadow that would never leave. Her heart raced again, but this time it wasn't from fear of him. It was the realization that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The front door slammed shut behind them, leaving Sarah in a house that no longer felt like home. The officers remained, a few combing through the house, others checking on Mark's body. But Sarah couldn't stay in that room. She needed air. Her thoughts were too loud, too tangled. She stepped outside, breathing in the cold night air. The sirens were still distant, but the flashing lights illuminated the street in a violent, rhythmic pulse. The world felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. She wandered toward the edge of the yard, her mind replaying the last few hours like a broken record.
Gary. Mark.
Victor. And the photo. That damned photo. The man in it wasn't just anyone. He had been there in the basement, watching her. She knew him. She had to. A voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah. She turned, startled. Detective Larson was standing behind her, his coat pulled tightly around him to ward off the cold. He was the one who had been running the investigation from the start. She had never trusted him completely, but now he looked different. His eyes were tired, but something about his posture felt off. Too rigid, too controlled. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp, almost desperate. "What does Victor know? What was all this about?" Larson gave her a long, measured look, like he was weighing whether to answer or not. Finally, he sighed. "You don't know, do you?" he asked, his voice low. "You've been chasing shadows this whole time, Sarah." Her chest tightened. "What do you mean?" The detective's eyes narrowed. "The photo. The man in the photo with Gary," he said, his voice growing quieter. "That wasn't just some random guy, Sarah. That man was someone you've met before. Someone you trusted. Someone in your own family." Her blood ran cold. She took a step back, her thoughts spinning. "No," she shook her head. "That can't be true. It doesn't make sense." Larson took a step closer, his voice almost a whisper. "The man in that photo? He's your uncle, Sarah. The one you never knew about." Her mind exploded with confusion. Her uncle? She had never heard of him. Gary never mentioned family. And if Larson was right, if this man really was her uncle, then everything she thought she knew about her life was a lie. Victor wasn't the only one pulling strings here, Larson continued, his eyes locked onto hers. There are people behind him. People who've been watching you for a long time. And they're not done yet. Sarah's head was spinning. Her hands trembled at her sides, as if she could no longer hold herself together. This doesn't make sense. Gary, he was my husband. He was supposed to be my protector." Larson's eyes softened for just a moment, but then the coldness returned. "I'm sorry to tell you this, Sarah," he said, "but Gary was never what you thought he was. He was deep in it, deeper than you ever realized." The wind howled through the trees, a chilling reminder of how isolated she truly was. She felt as though the ground was slipping from under her. The pieces weren't just falling into place, they were being violently ripped apart, scattering in every direction. And there was no telling where they would land. "Who else is involved?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Larson hesitated, as if the truth was too dangerous to speak aloud. "There's no easy way to say this," he replied, his voice low. "The people behind all of this, they're connected to you, Sarah. To your family. And they've been watching you for a long time. Gary was involved in something much bigger than you know. And if you don't understand that now, you will soon enough." Sarah felt a wave of nausea roll over her. Her legs felt weak. But Larson wasn't done. "Victor's just the tip of the iceberg. There are others. Bigger, more powerful players. And they won't stop until everything's been resolved." She couldn't breathe. Her mind was racing, and yet everything felt impossibly slow. "Resolved?" she repeated, her voice cracking.
What do you mean by that?
But Larson didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, pulling his collar up against the wind. The truth will find you, he said, his voice muffled by the night air. Whether you're ready for it or not. And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the darkness. Sarah stood there, alone in the yard, the weight of his words sinking in. The truth? What truth? Her breath came in shallow bursts. She didn't know if she could handle it. And yet, she knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. Victor wasn't the only danger. And she was now trapped in a world she hadn't even known existed. The game had just begun. And there was no way out. The wind bit at Sarah's skin as she stood in the yard, still processing Larson's words. The night felt suffocating now, as if the darkness had deepened, pulling her into something she couldn't escape. She stumbled back toward the house, her legs shaky, her head spinning. Her fingers clutched the railing as she ascended the stairs, the familiar sound of the porch creaking under her weight almost mocking her. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, but it no longer felt like home. The air was thick with tension, as though the walls were closing in on her, suffocating her with every breath. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Her mind was too clouded with questions. Who was her uncle? What had Gary really been involved in? The police had Victor, but Larson's warning echoed in her ears like a warning bell. Asterisk, the truth will find you. Asterisk. Sarah stepped into the kitchen, her gaze lingering on the spot where Mark had fallen. The blood was still fresh, staining the floor, a grim reminder of how everything had unraveled. Her eyes moved to the counter, where the torn photo from earlier still lay. She hadn't touched it since she dropped it, but now, something pulled her toward it. With trembling hands, she picked it up. The face in the photo, the man who'd been lurking in the shadows of her life, had been more than just an acquaintance. He was family. But the question that burned inside her was simple. Why hadn't Gary told her? She could hear Larson's words in her head, replaying over and over. Gary wasn't who you thought he was. Her stomach twisted. If Gary had been involved in something so dark, if he was a part of a criminal world, a world that stretched beyond anything she could imagine, then how much of her life had been a lie? Her hand tightened around the photo. The man in the picture. Her uncle. Victor had called him a player in the game, someone who had been pulling strings from behind the scenes. Her fingers itched to dig deeper, but fear was creeping in. What would she find? What would it cost her to uncover the truth? The house seemed to grow colder as she thought about Larson's warning. There were others involved, others who had been watching her for far longer than she realized. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. A soft creak from upstairs. Sarah froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't alone. Her hand instinctively went to her side, where the kitchen knife still lay within reach. Slow, measured footsteps echoed from the hallway, growing closer. It wasn't the police. It wasn't Larson. The steps were too light, too deliberate. Her breath hitched as the shadow of a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. A familiar face.
Mark.
His body had been lying in the kitchen just moments ago, lifeless, blood staining the floor. But here he was, standing at the top of the stairs, his eyes hollow and dead. Mark, Sarah whispered, barely able to breathe. He didn't answer. He just stood there, watching her with that same cold expression he'd worn earlier, the one that hadn't quite made sense until now. Her pulse raced. Was this a trick? Her mind raced with impossible questions. How could he be here? Then she saw it. In his hand. A phone. Mark's eyes remained locked on hers, but now, there was something different about the way he stood. It wasn't just confusion on his face anymore. There was something darker, something purposeful.
The phone rang.
It was his phone, the one that had been in his pocket when he died. The screen lit up, showing a number Sarah didn't recognize. Mark raised the phone to his ear. No, Sarah whispered, taking a step back. No, it can't be.
But it was.
Mark's lips moved, and his voice, a voice that should have been silenced forever, spoke from the other side of the line. Sarah, the voice said, smooth and cold. Did you think it was over? Her stomach dropped. The voice was familiar. It wasn't Mark's. It was Victor's. And then it clicked. Mark had been a part of this from the very beginning. He had been a pawn too. Just like her. Victor had never left. He was still in control, pulling strings, even from the other side. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her as the weight of it all crashed down. Mark wasn't just an accomplice. He was still a part of Victor's plan. And that meant the door slammed open. Two men stepped into the room, dressed in black. Their movements were quick, deliberate. They were here to finish what had started. Sarah didn't have time to think. She turned on instinct, running for the back door, her legs carrying her faster than she thought possible. She could hear them behind her, the sound of footsteps growing louder, but she didn't dare look back. The back door flung open just as the men reached the threshold. The yard was dark, shadows cast by the flickering streetlights. She didn't know where to go. There was no escape. But she ran anyway. The men weren't far behind. As she crossed the yard, Sarah felt it again, the sensation of being watched. The gnawing feeling that there was nowhere left to run. And then, just as her foot hit the street, she heard it. A voice in the dark. "I wouldn't run if I were you, Sarah." Victor's voice. It wasn't just a shadow.
It was the beginning of the end.
The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "I wouldn't run if I were you, Sarah." Her breath caught in her throat. Victor's voice echoed from the shadows, closer now, as though he were right there, breathing down her neck. She froze for a split second, her mind desperately trying to make sense of everything, to pull together the fractured pieces of her life that were now tumbling out of control. But the moment she hesitated, the men behind her closed in. Footsteps. Heavy, purposeful, and growing louder by the second. She couldn't afford to stop.
Not now.
Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her pulse screaming in her ears, as she sprinted forward, not daring to look back. The night was her only cover. The street was dark, the houses on either side looming like silent witnesses to the chaos unfolding in the quiet of the suburban neighborhood. She could hear them. Two sets of footsteps behind her. Quick and rhythmic. They were gaining on her. You can't outrun them. You can't outrun Victor. The thought struck her like a cold slap. Victor had already controlled the game. Now he had his hands around her throat, tightening with every step she took. She glanced to her right. The street was empty. No cars. No escape. Just more shadows. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a narrow alleyway between two houses, barely visible in the dim light. It was her only chance. Without thinking, she veered sharply to the left, her feet barely skimming the ground as she ran for the alley, praying it would lead somewhere. She barely fit through the gap, her shoulder scraping the rough brick, but she didn't slow down.
Keep going.
She rounded the corner, gasping for air, the alley winding deeper into darkness. Behind her, the men followed. She could hear them now, their voices low but urgent, as if they were talking to Victor, reporting her every move. Her mind raced with panic. She needed to think. Think. At the end of the alley, she spotted a high chain-link fence, the top jagged with rusted wire. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. She reached it in a few strides, her fingers clutching the cold metal as she scrambled to climb. The fence was tall, too tall for her to scale easily, especially with the fear of being caught right behind her. But she had no choice. Her fingers gripped the wire, her arms straining as she pulled herself up. Her foot slipped, scraping against the sharp edge of the metal. But she didn't stop. I can't stop. I can't let them catch me. With a final burst of strength, she swung her leg over the top and dropped to the other side, landing hard on the ground. The pain was immediate. Her ankle twisted awkwardly as she hit the pavement, but she forced herself to stand, ignoring the sting of her injury. She was in another alley, much narrower than the last, and with fewer houses around. There was no time to waste. Sarah limped forward, her breath ragged and shallow, every step on her injured foot sending jolts of pain up her leg. Behind her, The voices were getting closer. They were not far away. She looked around, but there were no signs of life, no doors to knock on, no allies waiting to help her. "I'm alone." She heard a voice again, closer this time. It wasn't the men chasing her. It was Victor's voice. "I told you, Sarah," he said, his voice coming from somewhere in the distance, yet somehow impossibly close. "You're running out of time." Her heart pounded in her chest. Victor wasn't just toying with her anymore. He was hunting her. She felt a cold sweat slick across her skin, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as the fear took root deep in her chest. They're getting closer. Suddenly, a loud noise shattered the night. The sound of a car engine roaring to life. A pair of headlights appeared at the end of the alley, cutting through the dark. For a moment, Sarah thought it might be some kind of rescue. Maybe the police had tracked her down. But then, she saw it clearly. The car was black, the windows tinted. It was a black SUV, rolling slowly toward her, its headlights blinding in the dark. She didn't stop to think. She turned sharply, looking for an escape route, but the alley was narrowing, closing off. The car was too close now. And the men, she could hear them, their footsteps in the distance, their voices rising with excitement. They were here. Suddenly, the SUV's engine roared louder, accelerating toward her. She didn't have time to think. Her foot throbbed as she took off running again, the pain of her injury mixing with the panic that surged through her. The SUV skidded to a halt just ahead of her, blocking her path. The doors opened. Two men stepped out. They were tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothing, their faces covered. Without a word, they started toward her, closing in from both sides. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs as she looked between them. She had no more options. No place to run. Asterisk, was this it? Was this the end? Asterisk. But then, just as the first man reached for her arm, there was a shout. A voice, loud, commanding. "Stop right there." For a moment, everything froze. The two men hesitated, looking toward the source of the voice. Sarah didn't dare move, her breath caught in her throat. And then she saw him, Detective Larson, standing at the end of the alley, his gun drawn, aimed directly at the two men. His voice was steady, unwavering. "I said stop." The men stood still for a moment, but then one of them made a move toward Larson. The detective didn't hesitate. He fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed down the alley, sharp and deafening. The man fell, clutching his shoulder, cursing under his breath. The other man hesitated, looking between Larson and Sarah, his expression full of calculation. But before he could react, Larson moved in, firing again. The second man dropped to the ground. It was over. For now. Sarah didn't know whether to collapse or scream. Larson approached her slowly, his gun still in hand, but his expression was unreadable. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. She nodded, barely able to speak, her body shaking violently. She couldn't process it all. Everything had happened so fast. The chase, the gunfire, the uncertainty, her mind was still racing, caught in a storm of terror. She started, but the words stuck in her throat. "Don't worry about them," Larson said, his voice firm. "I'll take care of them." She barely registered the words. Her mind was still spinning. Victor was still out there. And the game? It wasn't over. It had only just begun. Sarah stood frozen, the chaos of the night crashing over her like a wave. The two men lay motionless on the ground, their bodies twisted in unnatural angles, the pungent smell of gunpowder still thick in the air. Larson moved swiftly, stepping over the fallen bodies without a second glance, his eyes never leaving her. "Get in the car," he said, his voice sharp. Sarah blinked, still struggling to process everything. The adrenaline was wearing off, and now a heavy exhaustion was settling in. But she knew she didn't have time to think. Not now. She nodded slowly, her legs unsteady as she followed him. Her ankle throbbed, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through it. The detective didn't wait for her to catch up, moving quickly toward the black SUV where the two men had come from. The headlights still lit up the alley, casting long shadows as Sarah climbed into the passenger seat. Larson slid in beside her, the door slamming shut with a cold finality. The engine roared to life. "Where are we going?" Sarah finally found her voice, her throat tight. "Somewhere safe," Larson replied curtly, his hands tight on the wheel. "For now, anyway." She glanced over at him. His jaw was clenched, his face shadowed with something darker than she had seen before. The same man who had been trying to solve this case now seemed like a stranger to her, someone who wasn't telling her everything. "Victor, he's still out there, isn't he?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Larson's grip tightened on the steering wheel.
Yes.
She turned away, staring out the window as the city blurred past her. The streetlights cast fleeting glows against the glass, like fragments of a dream she couldn't wake from. The question burned in her chest, but she couldn't bring herself to ask it. She didn't want to know the answer. What did Larson know that he wasn't telling me? Minutes passed in tense silence, the sound of the car engine the only thing filling the space between them. She could feel his eyes flicker to her occasionally, but neither of them spoke. Finally, Larson broke the silence. "We need to keep moving. You're not safe yet." Sarah's chest tightened.
Why?
What's really going on, Larson? What was all of this? Why did he keep saying things like I was part of this game?
That my family was involved.
Larson's jaw twitched. He didn't look at her as he spoke.
You don't understand.
Not yet. She frowned, frustration mounting. I need to understand, Larson. I've been dragged into this nightmare. People are dying, and I don't know who I can trust anymore. He didn't respond right away. He just kept driving, his focus unshaken. But then, as the silence grew unbearable, he spoke again, quieter this time. Gary was deeper in this than anyone realized. He was playing both sides, Sarah. But the game, it wasn't just about him. It was about you. You're the key to it all. Her blood ran cold. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the seat. What do you mean? What do you mean I'm the key? Larson's hands tightened on the wheel. His gaze remained ahead, but she could see his knuckles turn white. That picture you found, the one with your uncle? He asked, his voice low. It's not just a picture. It's part of a bigger plan. A network of people who've been pulling the strings for decades. And Gary? He got involved because he thought he could control it. Sarah's breath quickened. And now they're all after me? Yes, Larson said, his voice hardening. Victor included. But it's not just Victor you need to worry about. There are others. Powerful people who will stop at nothing to finish what was started. And you're caught right in the middle of it. Her head spun. The road ahead seemed endless, but she felt like she was trapped in an inescapable maze. Every answer only led to more questions. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why are you telling me all of this now? She demanded, her voice rising. Larson finally looked at her, his eyes cold but tinged with something else. Regret. Maybe. Or something darker. Because I didn't know how deep it went until recently. And because, frankly, I didn't think you'd believe me. Hell, I'm still not sure you do. Sarah's chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. This is insane. Why would they go after me? I don't have anything to do with any of this. Larson's face hardened. You do. You just don't know it yet. The car turned sharply onto a darker street, the neon glow of the city fading as they drove into the industrial part of town. The buildings were tall, decaying, abandoned warehouses and factories. It felt like they were disappearing into a ghost town. He finally spoke again, his tone firm and final. We need to get you to a safe house. From there, we'll figure out what to do next. Sarah glanced over at him, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Safe house? You mean a hiding spot? How long can I hide, Larson? How long can anyone hide when they're being hunted by people like Victor? He didn't answer. And that was when she realized it. The truth. Victor wasn't just after her. He was after something else. Something that, once revealed, would make Sarah the last person in the world he could let live. The game wasn't about her survival. It was about control. Victor and his network, whoever they were, had been orchestrating this for far too long. And now, Sarah was part of the final act. She wasn't just a player anymore. She was the target. The weight of Larson's silence pressed on Sarah's chest like a heavy stone. Every inch of her body screamed for answers, but all she could do was wait as they sped through the darkened streets. The city felt miles away now, a distant memory fading behind them. The car's headlights cast long, distorted shadows against the abandoned buildings they passed, their broken windows staring back like hollow eyes. It felt like the world had emptied out, leaving only the two of them in this cold, eerie silence. Sarah's mind raced. The game isn't about survival, she thought, her pulse quickening. It's about control, but what did that mean for her? She had no idea. And Larson wasn't offering anything more. His clenched jaw and rigid posture made it clear that he wasn't about to reveal the full truth, at least not yet. She glanced at him again. He knows more than he's letting on. Larson, she said, her voice sharp despite the tremor in her throat. You have to tell me. Everything. Why did Victor say I'm the key? Why does he want me? He didn't look at her, but his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He was gripping it so tightly, as though trying to hold on to something that might slip away at any moment. Victor's not the only one who wants you, he muttered. You're not just a pawn in this game. You're part of a legacy, Sarah. A family legacy that's been kept hidden for a long time. That's why they're coming for you. The words hung in the air between them like a deadly fog, thick with meaning and unspoken truths. A family legacy? She barely processed it. Legacy, her family had always been ordinary. She never suspected they were connected to something sinister. But now, the pieces were starting to click into place, and she didn't like what she was seeing. Legacy? She repeated, her voice trembling with disbelief. What does that even mean? My family, they're not criminals. Larson's gaze flickered toward her for a split second before he looked away again. He was clearly avoiding her eyes. But Sarah wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. Why are you lying to me? She pressed, her voice breaking through the tension. Tell me the truth. Everything. He sighed as if finally giving in. Your family, he started slowly, carefully, is tied to a network that goes back decades. It's not just organized crime, Sarah. It's something much bigger. Bigger than Victor, even. These people control things you can't even imagine. And your uncle? He's one of the key players. Gary, he was involved too, but he didn't know the full extent of it. He thought he was in control. He thought he could manipulate it. Her blood turned cold. She could feel the floor beneath her feet start to crumble, the foundation of everything she knew slipping away. So, my uncle was part of this? And Gary was in it too? Yes, Larson said, his voice strained. But not by choice. You see, your family was always part of the plan. From the beginning. The way Larson said it made Sarah's stomach churn. She wanted to scream, to demand he explain more, but she couldn't. The words wouldn't come. She felt like she was losing her grip on reality. How could this be true? Then why didn't Gary tell me? She whispered, more to herself than to Larson. Why didn't he ever tell me the truth? Larson's expression softened, but only for a moment. Gary was trying to protect you. He was involved in things, Sarah. Things he couldn't get out of. He didn't want you to know because he thought you'd be in danger. But the moment he brought you into his world, that was it. You were a target. She recoiled from his words, feeling as though the very ground beneath her was crumbling. She had been a target all along. All this time, her life had been a lie, a carefully orchestrated game she hadn't even realized she was part of. Larson shifted in his seat, glancing at her again, his expression unreadable. And that's why Victor wants you. He wants the power your family's been hiding. He wants to finish what was started. Finish what? Sarah demanded, her voice sharp. What are they after? What does any of this mean? But Larson didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, his eyes focused ahead on the road. Your uncle, he made a mistake, he said after a long pause. He didn't realize how deep this went. Gary got in over his head, but he couldn't get out. The people he was dealing with, this network, they don't just let people walk away. They have plans. And those plans, they involve you, Sarah. A chilling sense of understanding began to settle over her. Me, she repeated. Why me? Larson finally met her eyes. You were born into this, Sarah. Your family has been part of it for generations. And now, you're the only one left. She felt as though the world had just slipped from her hands. Her thoughts were reeling, each question crashing into the next, faster than she could process them. Her family wasn't just innocent bystanders in this twisted game. They had been players all along, and Sarah was somehow caught in the middle of a legacy she never asked for. And Victor wasn't just some random criminal.
He was part of it.
Part of the very thing her family had been involved in. He wanted control, and he would stop at nothing to get it. But what was his endgame? What was the ultimate goal? The SUV made a sharp turn, and Sarah's head snapped back as they veered into an even darker part of the city. The buildings here were older, decaying remnants of a past long forgotten. Rusted signs hung in the dim light, their names erased by time and neglect. This place felt like a graveyard. She looked over at Larson. Where are we? He didn't answer right away, but his gaze flickered toward her, his face hardening again. We're almost there. Her throat tightened. Asterisk there asterisk? Where? What's going on, Larson's? He slowed the SUV to a stop in front of an old, nondescript building. It looked abandoned, its windows boarded up, the door locked tight. Larson reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a set of keys. This is the safe house, he said, his voice cold, almost distant now. It's the only place we can go where Victor can't find you, at least for a little while. But Sarah wasn't convinced. The safe house? Was it really a safe place? Or was it just another part of the trap? Larson put the car in park and stepped out without saying another word. Sarah hesitated, her hand still resting on the door handle. Her mind was spinning, but she knew one thing for certain. The game wasn't over. And it had only just begun. As she stepped out of the SUV and into the cold night, she felt it, a deep, gnawing fear. The shadows weren't just outside anymore. They were inside her, too. And no one was coming to save her.
Not yet.
The door to the safe house creaked open with a heavy groan, revealing a dimly lit hallway. Sarah hesitated, her hand still resting on the cold metal of the SUV door. The sound of the wind howling outside was the only thing that pierced the silence. Larson stepped past her, his face impassive, but his eyes were sharp, darting around as though expecting someone or something to emerge from the shadows. Come on, he urged, his voice low and urgent. We don't have time. She followed him inside, her every step echoing in the empty space. The walls were bare, painted in a dull, lifeless beige. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. It was clear this place hadn't seen anyone in a long time. Sarah wanted to ask more questions, but her throat was tight with fear, and Larson's silence was suffocating. He didn't look back, didn't offer any reassurance. He simply moved further into the building, deeper into its cold, hollow core. They reached a door at the end of the hallway, and Larson unlocked it with a single, practiced turn of the key. Inside was a small room, sparsely furnished, a couple of metal chairs, a wooden table, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. He walked in first, setting the keys down on the table. Stay here. Don't leave. I'll get things ready. Things ready? Sarah echoed, her voice strained with confusion and growing anxiety. What's going on, Larson? I can't keep doing this. I need answers. Larson paused, his back turned to her. For a moment he was still. Then, without looking over his shoulder, he spoke. I don't know how to fix this, he said quietly. The people who are after you, they're not just after your family's secrets.
They want you, Sarah.
Not just alive, but broken. You're the key to everything. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded, leaving her speechless. She wanted to scream, to demand more, but something about his tone, desperation mixed with defeat, made her freeze in place. I won't let them take you. But Larson's voice trailed off. They won't stop. No matter what I do. Sarah's breath hitched. Who are they? He turned, finally meeting her eyes. I can't tell you that. Not yet. His jaw tightened, and he looked away, almost as if ashamed. But you're not alone in this, Sarah. You have to trust me. She stared at him, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. Larson wasn't just some detective anymore. He was part of this twisted game. And the longer she stayed with him, the more she realized that trusting him might be her only option, no matter how little she understood. Larson moved toward the door, his hand resting on the handle. He looked back at Sarah one last time before he left. If they come for you, you run. Don't wait.
Don't hesitate.
The door clicked shut behind him, leaving her alone in the cold, sterile room. But as the seconds ticked by, Sarah felt it. The sensation that something was wrong, that the walls were closing in faster than she could run. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the room, but the only thing she could hear was the sound of her own breathing. Then a low, almost imperceptible sound, the faintest creak from the corner of the room. Her head snapped to the side. Someone was watching her. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt it deep in her bones. She wasn't alone in this room. And someone else had been here long before Larson had arrived. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer, the air thicker, suffocating her with its tension. A cold chill ran down her spine. The door was locked, but Sarah knew. They were already inside. Sarah's heartbeat echoed in her ears as she slowly turned toward the dark corner of the room. Her body tensed, every nerve alert. The faint creak she had heard earlier still lingered in the air, hanging like a threat. She strained her ears, listening for any sound, footsteps, breathing, a whisper. But there was nothing. Her eyes scanned the room, lingering on the bare walls, the cracked window with a sliver of moonlight creeping through, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The room was empty. Was it just my mind playing tricks? She shook her head, trying to dispel the unease clawing at her insides. But she couldn't shake the feeling. Someone had been here. She was sure of it. The faintest scrape on the floor made her jump, her breath catching in her throat. There it was again, a subtle movement from the shadows, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her freeze in place. She wasn't alone. Before she could react, the door swung open. Larson stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with alarm. His hand was gripping the doorframe, as if he'd just burst in to find her in danger. "Sarah?" His voice was urgent. "We need to." But he didn't finish his sentence. His gaze shifted from her to the room behind her. His face went pale. "Who else is here?" Larson demanded, stepping inside and scanning the room. His hand hovered near his gun, but he didn't draw it. Sarah swallowed, her throat dry.
I thought I heard something."
"A noise." "I'm not sure." Larson didn't seem convinced, his eyes narrowing as they darted from corner to corner. He moved to the window, peering out, then turned back to her with a grim expression. "It wasn't your imagination," he muttered. "Someone's been in here." A cold shiver crawled down Sarah's spine. "What do you mean? If someone was here, why didn't you?" But Larson wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on the door again, his hand gripping the gun tightly now. "We need to leave."
"Now?"
He took a step toward her, grabbing her arm firmly. "We've been compromised. They're closer than we thought." Before Sarah could respond, the sound of tires screeching to a halt outside the building made her blood run cold. Footsteps, hurried and heavy, echoed from the hallway. They were here. Larson's face tightened with resolve. No more running. No more hiding. This ends tonight. He didn't wait for her to react. With a swift motion, he led her to the back door, shoving it open just as the first shouts echoed from the hallway. A figure appeared in the doorway, masked,
Armed.
coming for them. Sarah's breath quickened, her mind racing. This was it. There was no more room to hide. No more time for answers. She had no choice now. They sprinted into the dark alley behind the building, the cold night air biting at their skin. Larson kept a tight grip on her, guiding her through the labyrinth of narrow streets, away from the dangers closing in around them. But no matter how fast they ran, Sarah knew deep down, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Victor was still out there. The network was still hunting her. And she had no idea just how deep this game went. As the city loomed around her, Shrouded in darkness, Sarah realized one terrifying truth. There was nowhere left to hide. This was her fight now, and it was far from over.